So I've been asked to talk about making peace in the world today. I'm starting off with what my approach to this word peace. Then I'm going to look at some of the current concerns. And then I'm going to look at some of the options for Australia. There is no shortage of options, but the problem is there's a shortage of public debate. So we've just had a general election, and really none of these big issues were addressed in that election. The two main political parties were locked into the standard approach, whereas no one was asking bigger questions. I'm also, unfortunately, battling a bit of a cold as well. So what do we mean by peace? Well, it's more than just the absence of war. It also involves cooperation and non-violent social change aimed at creating a more equitable and just structures in the communities and societies in which we live. So it's interesting that early on in World War II, the British government, Australian government, a lot of other governments, not yet the Americans or the Soviets, they had not yet entered the war, but they met at St James's Palace, which is in London, and they came up with this definition. The only true basis of enduring peace is the willing cooperation of free peoples in a world in which, relieved of the menace of aggression, all may enjoy economic and social security. The Australian government endorsed that as a definition of peace. Very interesting. That was written back in 1941. So some of the principles of working for peace: countries can win wars but lose the peace, and we've been seeing that really since World War II. You know, you get George Bush saying mission accomplished in Iraq. Clearly it wasn't. So you can win but then still lose the peace. And violence is not just about war alone. In the 20th century, more people were killed by their own governments than by foreign invasions. In our own region, for example, we think about East Timor being invaded by the Indonesians, a terrible amount of suffering. But then you look at what's going on in the world today at the moment, and many people are being persecuted by their own governments, not as a result of foreign invasion, but by their own peoples. I also, in the point that I talked about this morning, there has to be change within each person, and we talked about shalom, a biblical term meaning wholeness. So we're talking about more than just scrapping of weapons. We're talking about converting the weapons of war into the tools of peace, from swords to ploughs. My second PhD was looking at the economics of the arms race. And it's interesting that in about 41 days of military expenditure, we could provide water throughout all of Africa. These are the sums of money that go into the wasted expenditure on preparing for war. Given the fallen nature of humankind, I think there'll always be violence of some sort. And so a complete peace is not possible this side of the grave. So I'm sorry to be pessimistic. Bit of my Methodist background there. I just don't think, given our human nature, but we can certainly reduce the level of violence in this society, Australia or elsewhere. And I argued in one of my books about the triangle of peace. So one side of the triangle is disarmament, in other words, getting rid of weapons. The second side is conflict resolution, and Dr. Stella Cornelius in 1985 launched the Conflict Resolution Network as a way of trying to resolve disputes, because governments are not going to disarm within a security vacuum. They need to be able to be reassured that they can still exist with other ways of settling disputes. The problem is that too often we focus on war and not on peace. So it's interesting, in 1982, Britain and Argentina went to war over the Falklands, and a war took place. The Pope of the day was very much involved in that dispute, in the sense that his predecessor, 400 years previously, had drawn up a map of the world and divided the world between Spain and Portugal. And when the quill pen got down to Tierra del Fuego, it was very unclear as to who got what. And so the Pope of the day in 1982 sent in a team of mediators to sort out a dispute over Tierra del Fuego, which is Argentina and Chile. Chile was the only country to have supported Britain in the Latin American grouping in that Argentinian struggle, because Chile expected to be invaded, not the Falkland Islands. So the Pope thought, let's try to settle this dispute. And the Pope's mediators did. That was in 1982. No publicity was given to that. Now, coincidentally, a few years later, I was in Argentina for another meeting, but it coincided with the anniversary of Tierra del Fuego peace settlement. But no publicity, even in Argentina, was given to the peaceful settlement. So in other words, people grow up thinking that war is the normal way of trying to settle disputes, whereas in fact there's an entire history of the peaceful settlement of disputes which simply doesn't get taught in schools. So we ought to be giving far more attention, I think, to the history of conflict resolution and how we have been able to settle our disputes peacefully. So disarmament on one side of the triangle, conflict resolution on another, and then the bottom part is the search for justice, looking at the underlying economic and social reasons why violence takes place. So that's my approach to peace. It's very much more holistic than just saying get rid of weapons. There has to be alternatives to war, which is another one of my books, and also the search for justice. So that's where I'm coming from when I talk about peace. Let me get on now to look at the current concerns which a lot of people are asking me to talk about, which is the agreement between Australia, the United Kingdom, and the United States, what is called AUKUS, which has basically replaced ANZUS. When you get into international affairs, you're always dealing with initials. So remember, ANZUS was set up after World War II between Australia, New Zealand, and the United States. In 1950, the United States wanted to have a peace treaty with Japan and rehabilitate Japan, making it an American ally. The Australian government said, look, we were attacked by Japan. We want you to guarantee our safety in the event of Japan resuming its military ambitions. And so the United States government agreed to create ANZUS. And that agreement lasted from the early 1950s through until the mid-1980s. In the mid-1980s, David Long's Labor government decided that New Zealand would become nuclear-free, which it remains to this day. Irrespective of the party in power, New Zealand remains nuclear-free. And so the ANZUS agreement basically came to a halt. And so in the year 2021, Australia initiated negotiations with the UK and USA on this AUKUS agreement. It was done very quickly, done in secret. We were in the media, we were alerted the previous night there was going to be an important announcement the following morning, so we were all on deck waiting for the announcement, and as you know, there's the three-way television hookup with Scott Morrison, Boris Johnson, the UK Prime Minister, and Joe Biden, the American President. So what the Australian media tended to focus on the submarines, but the big picture is even more important. The French submarine program was over time and over budget. But China, which was the cause of the agreement, was not mentioned in any of those three statements. But China was the elephant in the room. And so I asked the question there, are the decks being cleared for action against China? Is this a variation of what is called the Thucydides trap? Thucydides was one of the parents of history, and he wrote about Greek history and the way in which you have an established great power challenged by a rising power, the tension between Athens and Sparta. Now, Graham Allison at Harvard has looked at the last 500 years of European, well, world history, but basically around Europe. For the last 500 years, there's been the history of the weird world. So we are all weird people. Western, educated, industrialized, rich, and democratic. You know, we often talk about the Third World, etc. Now, that's a 500-year period which began in 1492 when Columbus sailed the ocean blue. And so the Europeans started to move off their rocky outcrop at the end of the giant Eurasian landmass and encircled the world, which explains why I'm looking out on a sea of white faces, but we're actually on blackfella territory. So we have had 500 years in which we have dominated the world. And Graham Allison has looked at the last 500 years and looked at the way in which there were 16 arms races, one established great power being challenged by a rising power. Perhaps one that stays in our mind is Great Britain in the year 1900 being challenged by a freshly united Germany. And the result is World War I. 16 arms races, 12 of which have resulted in war. So the question which Graham Allison has raised is, are we risking sleepwalking into a war with China? The omens are not good. 16 arms races, 12 wars. Are we going to be able to avert a tragedy with China? Could Taiwan be the flashpoint to trigger that confrontation? And it's interesting that in the recent general election, neither of the two main parties questioned the viability of AUKUS. It was taken for granted by both the Liberals and Labour, and yet it's the peace movement in this country which is just saying AUKUS is not going to work out. Now, we've already paid $400 million for submarines. We've got no guarantee the submarines are going to arrive. The Americans are behind schedule in building their own submarines, and we have a congressional inquiry looking at whether or not submarines should be supplied to Australia. There's a similar parliamentary inquiry in Westminster where the British are asking the same question. And yet in Australia, we're in cloud cuckoo land, assuming that AUKUS is going to go ahead and no one's questioned it, at least not of the two main political parties. But I do issue the warning that the new Cold War between the United States and China is going to be different from the old Cold War. In the old Cold War, which was between the United States and Soviet Union from 1945 to 1951, that was mainly a military confrontation because the Soviet Union was excluded from the world economy. It excluded itself, and the Americans kept it out as well. A new Cold War has China right at the centre of that global economy, including via what's called the Belt and Road Initiative. So the challenge will be, how do you oppose militarily a major trading partner? It's going to be a much more complicated world into which we're moving. So let me conclude with what I call the bigger picture. So basic themes in Australian foreign and defence policy. Basic theme for since 1788. One has been the fear of invasion, that we're in the bottom right-hand corner of the globe, and somehow the rest of the globe is going to fall into our corner. All the politicians play to that sense of fear. You know, we had this dispute over asylum seekers, for example. And it's just playing into the fear. Totally unrealistic. If you're living in the United States, there is a problem. People can walk from Mexico into the United States. 1 million Syrians walk from Syria into Germany. You cannot walk into Australia. We're surrounded by a giant moat. But nonetheless, there is this fear in Australia that we are on our own, we're isolated. And there's a fear that Australia cannot defend itself on its own. And it's worth bearing in mind that Australia is responsible for about 10% of the Earth's surface. So you've got the mainland of Australia, plus Tasmania. You've got all the law of the sea that has given to us the exclusive economic zone, and which goes all the way around us. In fact, if you fly from Sydney to London, you spend a third of your time getting out of Australian airspace. And then on top of that, we are the largest single claimant of Antarctica. So put it all together, 10% of the Earth's surface. So it is a huge amount of the surface that we have. So we've always therefore had a need for since 1788, for a great and powerful friend, which was of course the UK and then later the United States. And we pay insurance premium, beginning with New South Wales troops in the UK's African conflicts in the 19th century. in the hope that the protector will come to our rescue if we're ever in a difficult situation. So in short, Australia's foreign and defence policy has been guided by the priorities of our senior ally, originally the United Kingdom, and now it is the United States. Australia is the only country to have fought alongside the United States in every war the United States has been involved in this century. We have a record of being supportive of the Americans no other country has got, including the UK or New Zealand. However, there is very little consistent public interest in this subject. People are anxious to be reassured that something is being done by somebody, and then they turn their attention elsewhere, mainly sporting results or Hollywood gossip. My segment on Channel 7 in the morning is the first one to be dropped if there's a sporting story or whatever. People are not interested in foreign policy. So what is the wider context? Well, I ask the question, is China a threat to Australia? I truly don't know the answer to that. How should Australia respond to a China-Taiwan tensions? Will we follow the American lead? Do we know what the American lead will be? The American lead is called strategic ambiguity. The Chinese don't know what the Americans are going to do. I think there are a lot of Americans themselves who don't know what they're going to do. For the first time since 1788, Australia's largest trading partner isn't part of the Western political military alliance. It isn't part of the European cultural heritage. It isn't a developed country, and it certainly isn't a democracy. Yes, China is going to become the superpower, but it's going to be doing things differently from the way that we've been used for the last 200 years. There's a practical issue. How do we operate a fully fledged nuclear-powered submarine fleet? We cannot recruit enough sailors to work on our current fleet. How are we going to work on a much larger one? I don't even want to travel on the Manly Ferry. You'll never get me on a submarine. So how do we recruit people to crew the submarines? Can we trust the United States? No country stays on top forever. I'm English. When I was born, we were running a third of the world. Now all we can do is organise royal weddings. We're all pomp and no circumstance. Is America itself in a state of decline? I've lived through the decline of Britain. Will I live long enough to see the decline of the United States? Could we have armed neutrality, perhaps on the Swedish model? Should Australia do more for its own defence, get rid of the US bases, reintroduce conscription, create compulsory forms of service in the military and civilian corps, and produce more of our own weapons and educate the general public to be more self-reliant? It's interesting that in Poland now, civilians are being trained to use rifles. They are so worried about the prospect of a Russian invasion that they are arming their own civilians. And that's the basis, by the way, of the Second Amendment of the American Constitution, which is the right to bear arms. So the US government, back in 1788, decided that if every American had a gun, nobody would want to invade America. Is that what we should be doing in this society? I'm not saying that as a policy recommendation, but I'm just doing that to explore the options, get people out of their comfort zones. Now, there's also the New Zealand option. Scrap much of our overseas military capability and reduce the American connection. Just decide, look, we are living in the quietest corner of the globe. Why do we need to have so many defence forces? Will Defence Force modernisation, which is the polite term for rearming Australia, simply trigger local arms races, and so Australia will be better off by not modernising and so seek to reassure the local region that we have no aggressive intentions? In other words, work with the Indonesians, etc. Could we create a ministry for peace and so do defence and foreign policy differently? For example, more economic and social cooperation. These are all the options that we have. The conclusion is that there are plenty of alternatives to the current policy, but a lack of political will and public pressure to make changes, which is why I'm very happy to go around giving community talks, just trying to encourage more of a discussion on community alternatives. Because clearly you can't rely on the two main political parties. They're just so locked into the old traditional ways of thinking. We need to be thinking much more differently. I'll leave it at that point, but be open to some questions. Mark, thanks.